Much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just take the opportunity to speak on part one of the bill here on two particular areas. One, following on from my colleague on the issue of delegation, and the other one is in protection of liability for public service chief executives. If I could just refer to a recent situation, and I'm glad the Minister's in the chair because she can probably answer some of the questions, around meat into China, where clearly there were delegated responsibilities to a public servant in China who had the responsibility for clearing large consignments of meat. We have yesterday, in fact, an announcement from the Minister that they're going to increase the resources. I think actually the truth is they're going to go from 1 to 3 people up there. So the question is, with the delegation, was it a responsible delegation that put with it the resource to do the job properly? Because we had a bizarre situation where presumably the chief executive, or the minister to the chief executive and then to an employee, had delegated powers, very important powers, of certification and of clearing the meat. Now, as it turned out, the minister criticised the chief executive and all the staff. So the question I have for the minister is, in that delegation, did the resources go with the delegation to ensure that work was carried out properly, and therefore the employee was responsible back through the chief executive? Or indeed, could the chief executive have said, actually, we didn't have enough resource to delegate with the job, with the role, and that is why the inadequacies and, in fact, the lack of performance occurred? So the question I have in that, and it's got a whole lot of detail here, and I acknowledge the Select Committee, they've clearly gone through, looked at this very, very carefully. You know, the delegations must be in writing. The functions of the powers delegated to a chief executive by a minister may not be delegated further without their prior written approval. So the question is, when you have such an important market, such as China and meat, where you have hundreds of millions of dollars going through, and we are told there was one employee in China to deal with the certification for that huge meat trade, whose responsibility was it for the delegation? And when something went wrong, who should take responsibility for that problem? Because the minister very quickly shunned it on to the ministry. So we assume it's the chief executive. So he or she could say, well, we didn't have enough allocation through the budget process, so we had to only have one person there. In fact, we found a bit more money for 2 other people. So it's pleasing to hear that for that particular incident. But the issue of delegation, which has been clarified, how the chief executive should delegate the powers and how the minister delegates them to the chief executive, all nice and dandy and all tidied up here. But the issue of accountability, Mr. Chair, I suggest, is something that also needs to be clarified. The age-old assumption, and my colleague Mr. Mallard here would know all this too well, about... Sorry, it's been around a while. Mr. Chair, yeah, that I haven't been the State Services Minister, I have to say, like he has. No, that's probably true, and I don't want to be. You know, can I say that the issue of the minister taking responsibility for the actions of his or her department is something that's been kind of accepted in politics for a while. We had the very unusual situation with the Minister for Primary Industries dumping fairly and squarely on the ministry. That was a new situation. So I'm not sure whether that is perhaps an indication of the new approach that the government is going to take under these changes here, whether it's the right approach or not. Did the Select Committee discuss it? Would be my questions, and perhaps the Minister for Food Safety is in the chair can answer that. Mr. Chairman, if I can move on to the second issue, which is in some way related to the incident I refer to, Mr. Chairman, and that is protection from liability for public service chief executives and employees. Because the Prime Minister, who's also a minister, indicated, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you. He indicated through that whole meat debacle that there was a possibility of there being compensation paid. And I guess that what we have here, of course, is clarity of the status quo. That is that no single individual should be liable for such a mistake. Indeed, the Chief Executive should not be. So the Minister, on behalf of the government, then carries the can for liability. And in fact, the taxpayer does. And one of the questions that the taxpayer does raise quite often is that shouldn't those bureaucrats be made accountable? And why should it be that the Minister, or we as the taxpayer, carry the can for any compensation from what they would call is a stuff-up or a mistake or a major logistical problem or clearly inadequate performance? And what this does is confirm that you know, the public servant, the civil servant, should not be liable if they've done something in good faith. Well, when the Minister then turns around, as he did, and criticises the Ministry for lack of performance, then the question of liability being sheeted home in some way, maybe not monetary, Mr Chairman, but in some way to an employee or more appropriately to the Chief Executive, is a very fair question that each and every taxpayer should ask. Because it is their money that is paying compensation. And so in part one here, we have, as has been the accepted norm, removed from the Chief Executive or an individual employee any liability for mistakes. So the Prime Minister rides in on his white horse and says to the meat industry, well, there may be compensation payable. And then the Minister, instead of saying, my department got it wrong and therefore I should be liable, the Minister muddies the water by saying, no, actually, the Ministry, the department, didn't perform here. They were at fault. And so the taxpayer rightfully might say, well, what then is the penalty that should be imposed upon the public servant or the individual who made the mistakes? Now, in every other part of the law, or I guess government systems, there is general accountability. People should be held account for their mistakes. But this is actually shifting it up the line effectively to the taxpayer. Now, is that the right thing? Maybe the Minister can take a call and answer that, because if the government is going to change and alter these things, then it should look at the situation that arose quite recently. I'm not saying that the Minister for Food Safety was just as liable as the Minister for Primary Industries, but I'm not sure whether she would have dumped on her agency in the way that the Minister for Primary Industries did. So the taxpayer, the hard-working New Zealander out there that pays their taxes to run these government agencies, to carry out these crucial roles, expects performance all the way down the line and expects liability all the way down the line. And so when, as has happened in the past, the Minister says, I take full responsibility, and if it is a big enough mistake, such as happened in Cave Creek or indeed at Pike River, then the appropriate Minister resigns. And I think people see accountability in that way. But when the Minister doesn't resign but turns around and dumps on the Chief Executive, then the question should be, does this protection here provide adequate accountability for taxpayers' money? So I leave it now to the Minister to maybe take a call and explain those things. It is a complex area of state sector accountability, responsibility. I can see it being really keen there.
There's a lot of common sense involved.
Well,
Been a dumb thing about it.
well, there could be. I don't know. Actually, we're not allowed to talk about the absence of any minister, but I'm sure that common sense could come to play here. Well, I think the party is anyway. I'm not sure about the member. but the party's certainly absent.
He's not a minister.
Look, I must come back to the point here. I don't want to be distracted by colleagues. I welcome the response.
Nikki Kay.
Mr Chair, look, I'm very pleased to take a call on this legislation.